Welcome to the podcast for History and Theories of Psychology, brought to you by Victoria University, produced and presented by myself, Paul Duckett. This is the unit where we look at the historical context of psychology from the early 20th century right through to today.
It's one small step for man.
Shut up and sit down.
One giant leap for mankind.
And greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right.
Every 4 computers now have primary control of critical vehicle functions.
This is our first podcast. It's a video podcast, but you can also download and listen to it as an audio podcast. This week we're talking about psychoanalysis, so I hope you find it of interest. So this week we are looking at Freud and the School of Psychoanalysis, and we're going to situate this within what are massive social upheavals that were occurring at the start of the 20th century. Now this podcast is going to continue with last week's lecture in regards to keeping us focused on the learning outcomes that have been assessed by the essay plan and by Essay 1. Now, as with the last lecture, this podcast is designed to give you that frame of reference with which you can understand psychology's far-reaching effect on society and how it offers not just a way of explaining human behaviour, but a way of regulating society. Now, I'm not going to fully develop those critical reflections in this podcast. What I want you to do is start to fill in your own reflections. I want to give you the room to develop your own critical thinking, and this is what you're going to need to do to meet the learning outcomes for the unit, learning outcomes 4 and 5, which is all about critical reflection and critical thinking. But I'll give you a framework that you can use, and then I'll leave it up to you to start filling out the details and developing your essay. So on to that essay, Essay 1. The task that you have is to critically appraise a history of either psychoanalysis or behaviorism, and say what that appraisal teaches us about psychology's involvement with one of 2 contemporary activities. One is coercive interrogation in the War on Terror, and the other is the treatment of mental illness. And I'll pick up both those practices and give you a framework to think about those practices in relation to psychoanalysis in particular in this podcast. Now, when we look at the School of Psychoanalysis and its historical context, we are going to concentrate on the Industrial Revolution. So particularly the transition from the first to the second Industrial Revolution, but also a little bit on the development of capitalism from social democracy through into consumer capitalism. Now, the period we're concentrating on is the period between 1900s and 1920s. But we're going to look a little bit beyond that, just through maybe into the 1930s and 40s. Now, psychoanalysis still has a very strong influence on the field of psychology, but it's now no longer considered a dominant school in psychology. The school of behaviorism took over from psychoanalysis and became the next school that dominated, and that happened around about the 1920s, 1930s. Though we're mostly stopping our reflections around about 1930s, I just want you to bear in mind that psychoanalytic theories are still very important today, and some of its importance comes from how it's become deep-seated in society, so outside of not only just in psychology, but outside of psychology. And it's become deep-seated in the socioeconomic structures of the West. And it's particularly taken hold in the public imagination, and particularly in the imagination of the corporations and governments. And the materials presented in the documentary by Adam Curtis, Century of the Self, really starts elucidating some of those connections for you. So it's remember that documentary, I'm going to refer to it a couple of times in this podcast. You can download the part 1 of the documentary from VU Collaborate, but also there's an abridged version which I've put up there. The whole documentary, there's 4 parts to it. If you watched all 4 parts, it takes about 4 hours. First part is about an hour long, and the abridged version are provided. Shows around about half an hour of footage from the documentary. If you're short of time, just watch the abridged version, and that will give you plenty of material for you to bring with you into our discussion in the seminar. Now, the connections we make today, not the only connections that you can make between psychoanalysis and broader things happening in society. What we're not going to focus so much on, but there'll be some reference to it, is war and social movements. So those other key historical themes that run through this unit. We can draw a bit on that in our seminar, but for this podcast, I want to concentrate on the industrial revolutions and a bit of consumer capitalism. Now, we also need to bear in mind where we sit on this timeline that we're looking at in this unit. So the timeline of the unit kind of starts about 1900s, really. But we're going to start sort of just at the approach of the 1900s, and we'll go through right until today. Now, an awful lot of that historical context that sits at the time that psychoanalysis is dominant is obviously outside our lived experience. So we're relying on other people's records of the events of those times. We're not relying on our own lived experience of those events. So that's something to bear in mind as we go through this early stage of the unit. Towards the end of the unit, we're going to start looking at psychology that is sitting within a historical context that is within our lived experience, particularly when it comes to the War on Terror, for example. But the War on Terror is obviously featuring in Essay 1, so I will make a couple of connections there towards the end of this podcast for you. So on to Sigmund Freud. So I just want to give you a little bit of biography of Sigmund so you can get a little bit of context there. Now, Sigmund was born in Freiburg, a small town in Monrovia, which at that time was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was the son of a poor Jewish trader who sold food, cloths and hides. The Freud family weren't well off. They often struggled for money. None of his family had attended university. Freud was the first in family to attend university. Now, when Sigmund was 4, he moved with his family to Vienna. Just to give you an idea of the size of the family, Freud had 6 brothers and sisters, and as I said, it was a difficult life for the family. They were troubled by financial matters, and Freud worried about financial matters throughout his life. He also worried a lot about his place in society, and the latter was largely due to Freud being a Jew. As a Jewish man, he experienced anti-Semitism. Now, there were some reforms in 1860 in Vienna which did allow Jewish people access to universities, but at that time in Vienna, Jewish people were still discriminated against. They were regarded as social outcasts. So when Freud was growing up, Jewish people, for example, were not allowed to practice in most professions, and they weren't allowed to hold high public office. Now, Freud was Jewish, but he didn't practice religion. He called himself a godless Jew. He considered himself a free thinker. He sought answers to questions like, how does the mind work, and what am I, and what made me this way? And he was very studious. He did very well at school. At quite a young age, Freud came to the conclusion that he was going to spend his life in science. When he was of the age that he could, he enrolled in the medical school at the University of Vienna, and there his interests first turned to physiology and then to neurology. He received his medical degree in 1881, and then he became engaged to Martha Bernays in 1882. Surname Bernays is an important one when you watch the Adam Curtis documentary, Century of the Self, as that documentary starts off by looking at Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays. So, back to Freud's story. So he got engaged, and after he got engaged, he decided to take up a post as a medical doctor at Vienna General Hospital. And this was a post which was very well paid, and it was very secure. And 5 years later, in 1886, he married Martha, and they had 6 children. And in that same year that he was married, Freud decided to resign his hospital post, and he entered into private practice where he specialized in treating people with nervous disorders. And from 1891 until the time when they left Vienna in 1938, Freud and his family lived in an apartment in Biography 19 in Vienna, and it was there where he started seeing his private patients initially with brain disorders, which he treated with physical therapies, and he later began treating more and more patients who were exhibiting what was called hysteria. Now, despite the disapproval from the Viennese medical community, Freud started using hypnosis as a way to help his patients, and he used it to help his patients remember forgotten memories, which in many cases were traumatic memories. And it was that point that Freud was developing his theory that people's physical illnesses were linked to deep-seated traumatic memories that were sitting in their unconscious. He would tell patients that their physical symptoms would be gone once they awoke from hypnosis, and the hypnotic process would be about bringing those unconscious memories to the surface. And once those unconscious memories were at the surface and could be worked on and resolved, that would alleviate people's physical symptoms. He was really happy with the results that he got from using hypnosis. That's largely where he started developing his psychoanalytic theory. Now, if you are watching the video podcast rather than just listening to the audio podcast, there's just a picture here of Freud's couch that was used by his patients. It was given to him actually by a grateful patient in 1890. If you're listening to the audio podcast and you don't see this picture, you can imagine it, and it's quite a famous couch. So when we think of psychoanalysis, we think of the therapist sat in the chair behind the patient who is laying down on the couch, therapist with notebook in hand, the patient doing all of the free association, talking about their dreams and all of the rest of it, and then undergoing hypnosis and so on. Now, there's an interesting story behind Freud's use of the couch. It's become such a powerful symbol. People thought, this must be integral to the therapy, the therapeutic process. Maybe it's part of his theory. It symbolizes something deep and meaningful in the therapeutic intervention he was developing and all the rest of it. The story is, though, when Freud was asked why he used the couch, his answer was that he was just sick and tired of staring at people's faces during therapy. Bugger that. Get the patient to lie down on a couch, I'll sit behind them, and then I can just relax a bit and just listen to what they're saying rather than have to worry about them looking at my face all the time. Anyway, a little bit of a distraction. Fun little story. History is full of fun little stories, really. Now, the less fun bit of the story is what happened to Freud after the annexation of Austria by Germany in 1938. This was when the Nazi Party took power, and the Nazi Party had a program of anti-Semitism, persecution of Jewish people, and they made it clear that all Jewish assets were assumed to have been improperly acquired. And among the policies of the Nazi Party were to strip people's assets from them Also to take people's passports away from them, take their documents away from them. People were not seen as legitimate citizens. Freud's family were one of the families whose passports were taken away. And once this happened, Freud knew that they had to escape. They had to get out of Vienna. That time in Vienna, not having official papers was effectively being given a death sentence. If you were stopped by an official from the Nazi party and you asked to present your papers and you didn't have papers to present, it was pretty serious. Now, if you want to learn a bit more about this story, about what happened to Freud and his family, what led to their escape, how they escaped from Vienna to London, there's a fantastic book called The Escape of Sigmund Freud by David Cohen. It was published in 2010. You can get it, the reference from the notes on VU Collaborate, linked to this podcast. So the book is a great read if you want to hear about the story, because it really is a very, very dramatic story about what happened to Freud and his family. Now, if we think about what happened in relation to psychoanalytic ideas, in regard to how they became dominant but fell out of favour with psychology around about the 1920s, and also how the therapeutic technique, the psychotherapeutic technique, started also to fall out of favour. That took a little longer to fall out of favour, but it certainly fell out of favour by the 1960s. I'm going to go back to our historical timeline just to think what else was happening around that time. Now, as I said previously, psychoanalysis and the ideas of psychoanalysis really took hold in society, and they lasted well beyond the 1920s. They're still with us today. Some of the key concepts we often talk about, things in our unconscious. We talk about how our personalities are informed by our childhood experiences, and that assumption that traumatic childhood experiences can manifest themselves into neuroses in adult life, and notions of repression and regression and so on. They're kind of words and concepts that now have penetrated into the public narrative, into people's consciousness, I suppose you could say. So you can find out more about how psychoanalytic ideas really penetrated into society through watching the Adam Curtis documentary. And I know that you probably have little time. You've got lots of things happening in your life, not just study. And the full documentary does take about 4 hours to view. But I would still encourage you to watch the documentary. If you watch the entire documentary, it'll take you through history right up to the time when Clinton took the US presidency and Blair was Prime Minister in the UK. And it shows how the psychoanalytic ideas were penetrating deep into society still by that time. And it also links into this notion, and we touched on it a little in our first seminar, where society started shifting from people being guided by a sense of duty through to a society where people started more to become guided in their behaviours through a sense of desire. And we picked up that very briefly, or the material is there to be picked up on, when we looked at the different traits associated with different generations through the 1900s up to today. Now, in this podcast, we're not going to look in detail at Freud's theory. So I'm assuming that this is material that you would have previously come across, given the stage you're at now in psychology and taking the year 3 unit. If you are taking this unit as a sort of freestanding unit on its own, I imagine you've heard of Freud. I would just encourage you to refresh your memory on Freud's theory about the unconscious and the conscious. But again, it's probably not that unfamiliar, because, as I said, these ideas have penetrated deep into our culture. So let's think about that time when psychoanalysis started losing favour. And it lost favour largely because it was viewed as unscientific. So in psychoanalysis, techniques such as dream analysis or techniques such as free association, those methods of projective techniques where it's the meaning is inferred or interpreted from the behaviors or the utterances of the patient or the research participant. These were seen as problematic because it all relied on the interpretative power of the analyst. So it wasn't possible to prove if the interpretation was correct or not, because it was just an interpretation come to by the therapist. And it is also difficult to prove something is correct because they're exploring the unconscious mind. So the nature of the unconscious mind is it's unobservable. You can only make conjecture or inference or interpretation or imagine what might be there. You can't for sure know what's there because by definition it's unconscious. So all of this makes Freud's theory unfalsifiable. His theories couldn't be proven true or false. And if you are a psychoanalyst, you can't prove that your interpretation of a patient's troubles are true or false. It's just a layer of meaning or interpretation that you're putting on them. Also, psychology started looking less favorably towards psychoanalysis because psychoanalysis couldn't predict people's behavior. It could only offer an explanation for people's behavior. And another area in which Freud's work was seen as unscientific was in relation to who he based his understanding on. So his theory was taken from an unrepresentative sample. He just based his theory on his observation of his patients. And I think it only included maybe one child. So it was a limited sample upon which he based his theory. So all in all, psychology came to the conclusion that Freud's theory were highly unscientific. Now I want us to draw a little away from psychology and just think about that notion of science in relation to what was happening in society in terms of dominant models of science. What were the big scientific ideas that were happening at the time that Freud was developing his theory and his theory started gaining that dominance in psychology, how it became a dominant school in psychology? Well, at that time, 1900s, 1920s, positivism was really being shaken about. Positivism is the scientific paradigm where there's an objective reality that can be understood through experimental inquiry. All the stuff that if you've been taking a sequence of units in psychology, where you have been trained in using experimental laboratory designs and writing up lab reports, laboratory experiment reports, and the rest of it. So that view of science, that kind of what we'll just call lab-based science, was being shaken around. It was being shaken around in physics in particular, and also in chemistry. So we had Marie Curie, who was paving the way for modern physics. She was opening the door to what would later become quantum mechanics. In regards to understanding the universe, we had Albert Einstein advancing his theories of relativity. So both these theoretical developments were starting to shake that foundation of positivist science, that there was an objective reality out there just waiting to be observed. Freud was up there among them in terms of challenging this dominant scientific understanding of the world, that there's an objective reality, because he was working in an area that was all about subjectivity and interpretation and meaning, and a lot of his work was informed by culture, and that's where we get all of those, the use of those Greek mythological figures, Oedipus complex and so on. So he drew a lot on culture, history, literature, and combined them with medical science. That's kind of the area that he was working in, and it was shaking up the dominant scientific understanding of the time. Now, it didn't shake the dominant paradigm out of psychology. In fact, the opposite happened. Freud's work and his theories and the school of psychoanalysis largely got rejected from psychology because psychology at that time started to become more entrenched into positivism. Where everywhere else were questioning positivism, psychology decided, no, we're going to stick with positivism, and that largely explains why psychoanalysis started to fall out of favor. Now, outside of science, and what was happening in the scientific community, there were huge shake-ups going on in Western society. So we can look a little at that just now, thinking about what was happening in society at the start of the 20th century. I started this podcast off by citing that this was a time of massive social change. And boy, were things changing. I mean, one way to think about what was happening in those early 1900s was society was moving faster. Everything was speeding up. So we had the mass production of high volume goods being produced on moving assembly lines. In particular, the automobile, mass production of cars. There were new ways of generating power that were fueling these new factories, large hydroelectric and thermoelectric power production plants and distribution systems. Things were being consumed quicker and things were being produced quicker. It was also the time where natural resources were increasingly getting exploited, coal and gas and oil and so on. At that time, there was little concern for ecological consequences of the exploitation of natural resources. Now, of course, there is major concern, perhaps not shared by President Donald Trump at this moment in time, at least, but all of the fears of climate change and so on. At that time, this was probably the point at which, early 1900s, that exploitation of the natural resources really ramped up significantly. It was also a time where consumer goods were being produced en masse, and we had low-cost appliances that were entering into the mass market. Vacuum cleaners, washing machines, and so on, and more people buying these things. And ways of communicating were getting quicker. There was radio and telephones and phonographs and high-speed printing presses that enabled the production of low-cost newspapers and mass-market magazines. There were quicker ways of traveling. People could move around quicker, and they could move faster and more comfortably long distances. So planes started to become more widely used, and trains and automobiles, all of these technological developments that the public started to access. So everything was speeding up, lots in terms of the production of consumer goods, but also the ways people were communicating and accessing information and moving around and so on. Things were also getting fuller. What I mean by that is that the cities were getting fuller. This is the process of urbanization, which was moving at a rapid pace. This was where people were moving from the countryside into the cities. This is where people used to work on the land in farms and agriculture, and with the development of the mass production and the big factories, people moved off the land into the cities to get work. They needed people to work in these factories. So cities started to become more densely populated. We saw the steel-framed buildings of great height appearing, the skyscrapers. This was the era where the first skyscrapers were being built. The other thing that was happening was that there were breakthroughs in medicine, big advances in public health, discovery of new vaccines and antibiotics. There's huge improvements in health, not just through medicine. Actually, mostly it was through improved sanitation and hygiene, building sewers and getting clean water supplies to people. Now, urbanization created the need for this. It created an urgent need for disease prevention and for public health, because you had large numbers of people all crowded in together into these cities, and the risk of an epidemic became much more likely and much more dangerous and much more in need of being prevented. So one person gets sick in a crowded environment, and that sickness can spread through infection, being passed on more quickly. Let's move on to marketing and the corporate world, because this is another feature of that time in the early 1900s. This was a time where the corporations started to grow and become powerful. The corporations were exploiting these new developments in economy of scale, where more goods could be manufactured, more quickly and distributed more quickly. and corporations started to up their scale of production and started to get very profitable. And one way that they became profitable was by trying to employ more people on lower wages. So what we also saw at this time was a strengthening of the trade union movement, which kind of acted like a countervailing force. So the corporations got more powerful, the workers started to unite as a social movement, particularly around this time, and the strength of the trade union movement was particularly pronounced during the early 1900s. And the legacy of that remains with us today, though unions are considerably weaker these days. Now, this period also saw the rise of mass market advertising and consumerism. So we had the nationwide branding and distribution of goods, which were replacing local arts and crafts. So what we now know of the marketing industry really started to develop during this time, because the factories were producing more goods, they needed people to buy those goods. Not everyone were inclined to buy these goods, so they had to market those goods. And again, that was where we started to see that shift between getting people to change their behavior by manipulating what they desired. Now, what I'd like to do is to start making some connections now at this point. We've laid out the theory of where psychoanalysis kind of came from, some of the historical things that were happening at the moment that psychoanalysis became a dominant school. Now let's see what connections we can make that will help you with your first essay. Also might help you put the fine touches to your essay plan as well, in anticipation of essay 1. Now the first connection I want briefly to look at is the connection between psychoanalysis and coercive interrogation. Here's one connection that's made by a psychologist. This is Stephen Reisner. He's a psychologist in New York. He was a co-founder of the Coalition of Ethical Psychology, who concluded that a lot of the early work in coercive interrogation came directly out of psychoanalysis or out of Freudian thinking. He discusses how studies of sensory deprivation and sleep deprivation were used to induce a form of psychosis in which people lost control over what they said and what they thought. And at that point, they could become more cooperative. That's the theory behind the use of sensory deprivation in coercive interrogation. You can also look at the Kubrick manual. I've posted that up on VU Collaborate. This is the CIA's Human Resource Exploitation Training Manual, the kind of how to torture people guide from the 1970s. Don't worry, it's from the 1970s. It's a declassified document. You're not going to suffer what Edward Snowden suffered by reading this or distributing this. It's now a public accessible document. But in that document, you'll find the language and terminology of psychoanalysis used. So you'll find in that document things like coercive interrogation, saying it uses the process of inducing psychological regression in a subject by bringing a superior outside force to bear upon a person's will to resist. So notions like psychological regression come directly from psychoanalysis. So you can start to see some connections here with psychoanalytic ideas, how they've become embedded, even though they're no longer dominant in psychology, they've become embedded in other areas of society, and we can see them embedded in military practice, particularly in terms of coercive interrogation. Now, in relation to mental illness, the other activity that you could concentrate on in your essay 1, what sort of connections can we make there? Well, again, it's looking for that language. It's looking for the language of neurosis, for example, and language that comes from psychoanalysis that is embedded in notions of mental illness that sit with us today. So you could look through the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and find where psychoanalytic terminology still exists. And you are likely to find it in some iterations of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual from previous iterations. You might be familiar with post-traumatic stress disorder. You may be less familiar that was originally known as war neurosis. So again, that concept of neurosis and psychosis. So you might want to see how the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual used that psychoanalytic framework in terms of classifying people's mental disturbances using the language of psychoanalytic theory. Another route into thinking about this, and this is one that could connect these two topics, and it's one that is spelled out nicely in the documentary by Adam Curtis, is the use of psychoanalytic ideas in marketing. So remember, when we came just to the end of the bit of the podcast where we looked at how the big changes happening in society was a time where marketing really kicked off, there is an argument that the legacy of psychoanalysis has survived largely because it was picked up by marketing and what was still known as public relations, using psychoanalytic theory. So in relation to mental illness, you can think about how the treatment of mental illness has been affected by the use of marketing of psychotherapeutic drugs, and how marketing of drugs has led to the promotion of the idea of mental illness, i.e. more people think that they need these drugs because they think that they have these illnesses. But you can think in terms of the widespread use today of antidepressant medication and the amount of investment that is made by drug companies in marketing psychotherapeutic drugs. We did have a look at this issue briefly, I think, last week in the lecture. So you could develop some of those ideas in your essay. And again, it's making that connection with psychoanalysis and the treatment of mental illness by using the notion of marketing, how marketing influenced, psychoanalytic ideas got embedded in marketing, and how marketing was then used to promote drug treatments for mental illness. And ultimately there you've got a connection between psychoanalysis and the present day, what some people are describing as a crisis in relation to the treatment of mental illness. So we have, for example, a lot of activity that's put in by drug companies raising awareness in the public about mental illness, and it's a kind of solution to the problem of people not taking a drug because they don't consider that they need a drug. So it's again creating the need for a product. Convince people they've got depression, then they'll need to buy your drug, for your antidepressant drug. You get the message. So that's a connection you can make. And of course there is that connection with marketing and war. If you look at the Adam Curtis documentary in part 1, the part that we're discussing in our seminar, the connections made between psychoanalysis and war propaganda. War propaganda is a form of marketing. We don't like to call things propaganda these days in relation to marketing, and that's why it's largely now referred to as public relations. So the history of marketing, the development of marketing, can relate both to those topics of coercive interrogation in the context of war on terror, for example, as a part of the war propaganda, but also in terms of treating of mental illness through the marketing of psychotherapeutic drugs. So it's really a big flag there waving, saying that Century of the Self, documentary by Adam Curtis, view it. If you haven't viewed it yet, view it, and we'll be able to use the material there, which is goes into much more depth on some of these issues, and particularly locates these issues in that historical context. It'll give us some rich resource which to pull upon to get some good discussion going, and it'd be good for you to hear the views of your fellow students on some of this material too. Now, to finish off, I just want to give you another little resource. Again, I'll post this up on VU Collaborate, a web link. There's a nice little resource that gives you a timeline for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Now, this little resource gives a good timeline for how the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual developed, and it could be a good resource for your essay if you want to link psychoanalysis and history and treatment of mental illness together. So, as we draw to a close, just to lighten things up a little bit, when we're thinking about the way psychoanalysis is now not really favoured in psychology, we still can see how it is influential in society, this popularisation of the talking therapy. So there's a little clip here from the Big Bang Theory, which you can view at a later point, or I'll just leave the link up on VU Collaborate as well, so you can just go straight to that link and watch that clip if you like. So to finish off and conclude this podcast, that's my material for you to consider on psychoanalysis, and we'll have room to discuss some of the material from this podcast in our seminar, where you can talk through some of these ideas with your fellow students and see what sort of position you want to hold in relation to some of these issues, because some of this is quite controversial. So it'll be hopefully a really lively discussion that we'll be able to generate in the seminar. Okay, till next time, thanks for listening, thanks for viewing, and see you soon.